Hello Caymans, Mr. Riker here, coming at you with a lesson on solving quadratic equations by factoring, lesson Q3. So let's get started. When we solve by factoring, the zero product property is really essential. It says for any real numbers a and b, if a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. This doesn't work for any other number. There is no one product property. If a times b is 1, one of those numbers doesn't have to be 1. It could be like 1/5 times 5. It could be 1/3 times 3. But with 0, if you multiply two numbers and you get 0, then one of those has to be 0. And we use this zero product property throughout this lesson and several other areas of mathematics. The way that I'm going to be factoring these is called factor by grouping. Now, some of you might be really proficient at factoring, and you don't have to factor by grouping, but that's okay. I like to show factor by grouping because it gives students who aren't very good at factoring kind of a methodical way to factor. And maybe at this point I'll just mention that if you haven't printed these notes, it would be helpful to print those, but in this lesson we won't be graphing anything, so it's not as essential to print the notes, but it is nice to print them so you have them all handy. Let's look at this first one. Solve each equation by factoring. So to factor by grouping, we're going to take the a value, which is 1, the b value, which is 5, and the c value, which is -24. We'll kind of set up our work a little x like this, and in the top of the x we multiply the a and the c, in the bottom of the x we place the b. So we're going to have a times c is 1 times -24, and then the b is 5. So we want numbers that multiply to -24 that will add to 5. So numbers that multiply to -24 and add to 5, that would be +8 and -3. Those multiply to -24 and they add to +5. So we're going to rewrite this equation. Basically the idea is we're taking this middle term, 5x, and we're splitting it. So we have x squared. We're splitting that 5x to be that 8x and that -3x that we had over here, and then bring down the 24 equals 0. Once you've split the middle term, now we factor by grouping. We have 4 terms, so we're going to group these first two and group these last two and take out the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor between x squared and 8x is just an x, so pull an x out and we have x plus 8. The greatest common factor between -3 and -24 is a -3. We have x plus 8 equals 0. If you're doing this process correctly, you should get identical terms. And then the next step, those identical terms, we're going to factor out an x plus 8. And when we factor an x plus 8 out from both of those, we are left with the stuff on the outside, x minus 3 equals 0. At this point, we can use the zero product property. We have a product, x plus 8 times x minus 3, and we get 0. So that means either x plus 8 equals 0 or x minus 3 equals 0. So our answers to our quadratic equation, we have x equals -8 and x equals 3. Now you might notice that in the original up here, I got an 8 and I got a -3, whereas here my answer is +3 and -8. That's kind of coincidental in this case. That's just because we had a 1 for the a value. If you don't have a 1 for the a value, then those numbers aren't going to match. But that's factor by grouping. We're going to do several more examples. We're going to do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then as a try this, you'll be doing 7, 8, 9. So let's look at the next example. We'll factor by grouping. We'll multiply the 6 and the -4 to get -24, and we write the 23. So we want two numbers that multiply to -24 that add to 23. Adding to 23, you'd need a pretty big number, so probably need 24 times 1. And that 1 would have to be a negative. So we're going to take the 6x squared, we're going to split this middle term into two terms. Those two terms, we're using this 24 and this -1. So we'd have plus 24x minus 1x minus 4 equals 0. It doesn't matter the order you put those. You could put -1 and then 24. I put 24 then -1. Doesn't matter. So the greatest common factor is next. The greatest common factor would be a 6x, at least for the first two terms. These two we factor, those two. So we would have x plus 24. And then between -1x and -4, we would have a -1. And you have a x plus 4. Notice the signs change. So we get those identical factors. And we're going to factor out that x plus 4 from each of those terms. And we're left with the stuff on the outside. So this is our factorization. And then we use the zero product property. Zero product property, prop. So x plus 4 equals 0, or 6x minus 1 equals 0. So we get x is -4, and we get 6x equals 1, so x equals 1/6. And it is pretty common to get fractional answers, so don't be too surprised. That was number 2. Let's look at number 3. Number 3 should be set equal to 0, and it's not, so we'll add 5x to both sides first. And then we'll do our process. I'd encourage you to pause the video, see if you could take it from there, and then get your answer. Fast forward the video, see if you got the right answer, and then you can go back and watch the details if you didn't get the right answer. So we're going to multiply 2 times -12 to get -24. We have 5 down here. And factors, that would be a 8 times -3. Those multiply to -24 and they add to 5. So we would rewrite this middle term. We're going to rewrite it using these two numbers. So we have 2x squared plus 8x minus 3x minus 12 equals 0. And then we'll do the greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor for the first two would be a 2 and an x. You'll often have an x in that first one, that first set, probably always. And then minus 3, we get an x plus 4 equals 0. Notice we get identical binomials, so that's promising. We factor out that identical binomial, and we're left with 2x minus 3. So now the zero product property, either x plus 4 equals 0 or 2x minus 3 equals 0. So we get x equals -4 or x equals 2. That was number 3. Number 4 is all kind of set up for us. We're going to multiply, get -24, get a 5. Get kind of lucky we have similar numbers each time. That won't always happen. So we get an 8 and a 3. We're going to split the middle term, use these values. So we get 6x squared plus 8x minus 3x minus 4 equals 0. We're going to take a greatest common factor from the first two and a greatest common factor from the next two. So the greatest common factor between 6 and 8, I think, is just a 2x. That leaves us a 3x plus 4. And then we're going to factor a -1 out. You should put the negative and the 1. And that leaves us an x plus 4. And then notice we have identical binomials. Wait, we don't. Oh, I see my mistake. So when we factor a -1 out, we have 3x plus 4 equals 0. Now we have identical binomials. So we can factor out that identical binomial, 3x plus 4, and we're left with the stuff on the outside, 2x minus 1. So setting both equal to 0, we would have x equals -4/3 and x equals 1/2. On to number 5. Number 5, I notice that each of these coefficients is even. So let's divide everything by -2, divide both sides by -2. So that gives us x squared minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. And then we can do our process. Numbers that multiply to 8 that add to -6. So I think that would be a negative 4 times a negative 2. That multiplies to a positive, but it adds to a negative. So we're going to split the middle term and use those two numbers. Minus 4x minus 2x plus 8 equals 0. We're going to factor, take the greatest common factor. So the greatest common factor we have is x minus 4. Take a negative 2 out, and you get a x minus 4. It's important to take a negative out there. And notice we have identical factors. So we have an x minus 4. We have an x minus 2. The stuff on the outside is in its own group now. So we get x equals 4 or x equals 2 when we set both of those equal to 0. And then the last one, I'd encourage you to pause the video, see if you can get the answers, and then you can fast forward the video and see if you got the answers. But first we should have this equation set equal to 0, so we're going to add 3 to both sides. And we're going to multiply the 4 times 3 to get 12, and the 8 goes in the bottom there. So factors that multiply to 12 that add to 8. If you're confused, you could write out the factors of 12. There you go. And these two look like they multiply to 12 and add to 8. So we're going to take that middle term and substitute it with the 2 and the 6. So we have 4x squared plus 2x plus 6x plus 3. We're going to take the greatest common factor from the first two terms and then the next two terms. It's called factor by grouping. So we'll have a 2x from the first two. We're left with a 2x plus a 1. You can always check your work by distributing the 2x in, and you should get back to 4x squared plus 2x. Plus 3, 2x plus 1 equals 0. Notice we get identical binomials, so that's promising. We didn't make a mistake. And we get a 2x plus 1, factoring out those red lined ones. And the stuff on the outside is 2x plus 3. That becomes its own product. So setting both equal to 0 with the 0 product property, we would get x equals subtract 1 divided by 2, x equals subtract 3 divided by 2. So those would be our two answers. So that's solving by factoring, factor by grouping. We would like you to answer 7, 8, and 9 on Schoology as a try this. Thanks for watching this video. See you next time.